Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Davies, and on behalf of Arizona State University, I'd like to welcome you all to this conversation between myself and Nidhal Guessoum. The conversation will be about the origin of the universe and Islamic perspective, and it's being pre-recorded as part of the forthcoming conference on religion, ethics, and science being hosted next week by ASU. Nidhal and I will talk for about 30 minutes, after which Imam Omar Tawil, who's leader of the Islamic Community Center of Tempe and chaplain with the Muslim Students Association at ASU, will offer a brief response, followed by a few questions from you, the audience. My own position at ASU is Regents Professor of Physics and Director of the Beyond Center for Fundamental Concepts in Science. I'm a theoretical physicist, and most of my work has been in the area of cosmology and astrophysics, but in recent years I've also become interested in astrobiology, that is the search for life beyond Earth. Dr. Nidhal Guessoum is Professor of Physics and Astronomy at the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. His research specialty is in the area of gamma ray astronomy. Nidhal is also well known for his books on science and Islam, the most recent of which is The Young Muslim's Guide to Modern Science. So Nidhal, first let me thank you very much for taking part in this conference. Would you like to add anything to what I have said in my brief description by way of introduction?
Well, I would like to start by offering the greetings of peace, Assalamu alaikum, which is the Islamic way of greeting people. And secondly, to thank the organizers, starting with Ben Sanders, who has contacted and written and tried to put together this conference overall and this specific recording. And to thank you, Paul, for also all your efforts and all our friends who are participating in this. You've presented me more than well enough. I just want to add maybe one aspect of my career, perhaps more in recent times, but also throughout my life. I have always liked to disseminate science, to disseminate proper knowledge. So I have written a number of books for the general public. I have a YouTube channel that has hundreds of thousands of subscribers. I am also active on social media, on Twitter. I have more than 100,000 followers, Facebook. Likewise, I appear regularly on TV for interviews, particularly when there are space or astronomy events. And we are just about a week away from the arrival of the Emirati probe to Mars on February 9, or actually when this is going to be broadcast, hopefully the probe will have successfully entered orbit around Mars. So that's my life. I am a scientist. I continue to do research in astrophysics, gamma ray, but I am first and foremost an educator, formally at the university, but also more broadly to the general public.
Well, tell me a bit about your background. I'm always interested to know because in my own case, I always feel I was born a physicist. And so from the earliest age I can remember, I wanted to do theoretical physics and astronomy and cosmology. So did you always want to be an astronomer? What was your childhood like?
Yeah, so my path and career and life has been a bit different from the standard sort of scientist career. Most scientists actually are like you, Paul. They say from an early age, I was fascinated with the sky and I got my first little telescope when I was 6 and this and that. I didn't have any of that. I didn't imagine I was going to be an astronomer. But I was always fascinated with science. The one thing I want to sort of tell you, which most people don't know, although I mention it from time to time in my writings, is that my father, who is today 87 years old, is a philosopher by training and a religious scholar in the sense that he learned the Quran by heart when he was a kid, like most of the kids in his time, and pursued Islamic studies, but specialized in philosophy, and for a while was a professor of philosophy, dean of the School of Philosophy, chair of the department, and so on and so forth. And my late mother was a literature person, So we grew up at home with lots of discussions around the dinner table that mostly revolved around issues of religion, issues of politics, issues of education. We almost never had any science discussion around the table because my parents really didn't know any science. And to this day, my father has very, very little knowledge of science. But all the kids ended up specializing in science, myself and my two brothers and two sisters. One went into artificial intelligence, computer science, when one went into medical school, one did applied math and then did an executive MBA, one was a teacher of biology for 20 years, and so on. And so I think it was that discussion of reasons and arguments and evidence and how do we know this and why do you say that and what does our religion tell us, whereas where does the current knowledge take us and how do we reconcile the two? And so that urge to put all of this knowledge, whether profane or sacred, to put it together in one's mind, in one's family, in one's culture, was with me from an early age. And so once I discovered physics, it was like love at first sight. And once I discovered astrophysics, it was, sort of second love or something. So that's essentially my childhood and life story.
Well, you're very lucky you had that family support. My family didn't really care very much one way or the other about my career. They just sort of a bit odd. I'm the only scientist in the family, and they didn't really see the use of studying things like astronomy and cosmology. My mother always wanted me to make some sort of robot to help her with the housework. So that's as far as I got. But I'd like to talk to you about topics that always come up in connection with astronomy and cosmology. And this must happen to you. You go to dinner parties, and when this sort of comes out, people always want to know about the origin of the universe, about the Big Bang and what happened before the Big Bang, and can science explain the origin of the universe, or do we need a pre-existing creator, and if so, what was that creator like? And you come right up against the age-old questions which have been asked in philosophy and religion for millennia, and now science puts its own spin on this. So I'd like to very much hear your own take. When people say to you, well, what happened before the Big Bang, what do you say to them?
Yes, so this doesn't only come in dinner parties. This comes up in the classroom. This comes up in, cafeteria of the university, in every place where we get to talk about science, because my culture or this part of the world is so dominated by the religious culture, the religious education, then of course people are always asking the question of, how does this fit with this, and how do these two relate? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, when we read the Quran and our education, I remember when I was a kid, cosmology, what we call today cosmology, didn't have the same meaning as what we consider as cosmology today in science. Today, you're a cosmologist. I'm not really a cosmologist. I'm an astronomer, astrophysicist, but I have taught chapters on the Big Bang and so forth. When we talk about cosmology today, we consider it as a branch of astronomy, as a branch even of physics and of mathematics. What is the universe? The universe is all the objects and matter and energy and radiation that exist out there. And how do we describe them? What are the laws that regulate all of this through space and time? How did this evolve? Since now we know that the universe has evolved, was not always in this sort of state that we see today. So we consider today cosmology as a branch of science. But when you go back to the previous, maybe we say medieval culture, although the word medieval has a little bit of a negative connotation, but what I mean is centuries ago, millennia ago, people didn't look at the cosmos as this object of scientific study. It was this realm of existence and where we fit in it and how we relate to it, not how do we put it into our equations or subject it to our observations and experiments. In fact, you may be surprised, or the audience may be surprised, that the word universe, which today in the Arab culture is always, we always use the word kawn for it. Kawn means exists or is or being. This word for universe, commonly used in the Arab language now for decades and decades, does not exist in the Quran. There is no such thing as the universe, the way we consider it today, as this physical entity that can be studied or described by science or other. It does not mean that it should not be studied by science, but it means that the way the cosmos is considered is very different. So how is it considered? It is considered, the expression that is used in the Quran and in the Islamic tradition is the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth. This is used dozens of times in the Quran, and in fact, it is also used in the Bible. And the reason for that is because it is always emphasized that we are the human species has a home. So this is earth, and then we open the window and we look out into these heavens, and so it is how the heavens relate to us or how we fit with these heavens. So it is this sort of complementarity, this relation between us and the rest of what we today consider the universe that is emphasized. So it's not, let's look at it from a detached point of view, completely objective. It's an object, just like we're studying the sun or we're studying some object somewhere. We are considering the universe as the counterpart to humans and earth. So this is number two. Number three, every time the heavens and the earth are described or mentioned in the Quran or in the Islamic tradition, it is always in relation to God. So the existence of God and the creator, the fact that this heavens and earth, this universe or cosmos is related to God is sort of a given in the Islamic tradition. It's not, okay, let me prove to you, or let's discuss where this universe came from. These two things go together. Now, we may or may not be convinced that they should go together by default, that this should be argued. And indeed, when we got to later Islamic tradition, a couple of centuries after the emergence of Islam, after the revelation of the Prophet, Muslim philosophers, Al-Kindi in particular, started to propose what is now known as the cosmological argument, the famous Kalam argument. So that, yes, we can now try to argue for the existence of God on the basis of the existence of the universe. That's number three. Number three or four, I have lost count of how many arguments I have made now or how many points. But the last point I want to make is the following. In the Quran, whenever this heavens and earth, this cosmos, this universe with us is mentioned, there are two very important issues or arguments that are always emphasized. One, there is order and regularity in the cosmos. And this is sort of, we can describe it as the famous design argument or the argument from design. But this is always there, always. Look at how things are beautifully working. Look at the order, look at the elegance, look at the regularity. And what is the point of this emphasis? The point of this emphasis is that it means there is a God behind it who sustains. These things cannot be regular and ordered and beautiful and elegant and constant just by themselves. So that's the underlying or implicit argument, that there must be a God that has not only set these laws that give you this regularity and order, but he must be there to sustain it. In fact, there is a verse in the Quran that says very clearly, if God was not sustaining the heavens and the earth, then they would disappear. They would not just crumble or there would be chaos or something. They would just disappear. That's the statement in the Quran. Number two, that this cosmos and our existence in it has purpose. There is a reason for all of this. It's not like, okay, God one day said, let me have some fun and have some kids over there playing in the yard and just look at them, how they do, just like taking the kids to the park and sitting there and enjoying their play. God created all of this for a purpose. And then we get into issues of, are we the purpose? Is there another greater purpose? Are there others out there? How can we be the purpose if we are such a small little home in this immensity of the cosmos that we have today? So I just wanted to sort of give a broad and wide, maybe a little bit lengthy description of the Islamic view of the cosmos, cosmology, the universe, humans, regularity, sustaining, and so on and so forth. And then we can discuss, okay, so what happened before the Big Bang and all of that? I'm happy to address that question. I haven't forgotten, but I just want to give you a chance to maybe redirect the question or follow up before we get to what happened before the Big Bang.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Nidhal. And of course, what you're saying is familiar to a lot of Christian theologians, very much, the cosmological argument, design argument, and so on. But what has always interested me is God and the nature of time, because before Einstein's general theory of relativity, it was sort of assumed that maybe the universe had existed forever. And indeed, my first job was in Cambridge with Fred Hoyle, the architect of the steady state theory. That was a model of the universe that had no beginning or end, just continually replenished itself. But now I think we all feel that the universe, at least as we know it, came into existence at a finite moment in the past, 13.8 billion years ago. And the question is, was that also the origin of space and time, or just the beginning of a new phase? And God's relation to time, of course, has a very long tradition, a very long debate about that, going back in the Christian tradition, at least, to Augustine, who said that the world was made with time and not in time. So he had the notion of God as a sort of timeless being, or a being who transcends time, sustains the universe at all moments, but that means that we don't vest too much significance in the originating event itself. God is always present at all times. But a lot of people, of course, still like the idea of a God who precedes the universe, is sitting there before the Big Bang and makes the Big Bang go bang. And you can find contemporary theologians to argue for both of these positions, of a God sort of embedded in time and a God who's a bit more abstract and transcends time. Is there that same tradition within Islam? Are there scholars who will argue for a timeless God, eternity meaning outside of time altogether, versus a God who's embedded in the stream of time and therefore maybe interferes in the affairs of the world? Are there both those traditions?
Yes, except maybe for the one last thing that you said, which is this embedded in time. I don't think this is, maybe there are a few people who say something like this, but in my readings, I don't find Muslim theologians saying God is embedded in time. We certainly find that God is eternal outside of time, and that he relates to the universe or to time in a different manner. So the first thing that we find in the Quran is that time for God is not the same as time for humans. So this is very important. There are explicit statements, verses, where it says, and one day in the eyes or with God, for God, is like 1,000 years of your reckoning. And in another verse of 50 is equivalent to 50,000 years. So it says it's not the same time. Secondly, there's this phrase that repeated several times in the Quran, that when God wants to create something, he only says to it be and it is, which means the interval of time, delta t, that it takes for something to work out is zero for God, is zero. So it really doesn't matter if the earth took millions of years to form, or if the universe evolved over billions of years, or if the sun is going to die, in 5-6 billion years. It really doesn't matter. For God, it's create and it is, which means time for him is not the same as time for humans. Now, when we read the attributes of God in the Quran, the famous 99 attributes of God in the Quran, in the Islamic tradition, they're not all in the Quran, by the way, the 99, but in the Islamic tradition, 99 names of God or attributes of God, it is interesting that they can be divided into two groups in my reading, at least. One is something that tells us that God is transcendent, is outside of all of this. He is the first and the last. He is the everlasting. He is the omnipotent. He is the omniscient. He is the powerful, and so on. And then there's a group where he is the compassionate, the loving, the forgiver, the giver of mercy, the just, and so on. So there is two aspects to God. God, the creator, who is outside of all of this, and for him, time is like nothing. And then there is this God who is in direct relation to us and is responding to us and is interacting with us, hears us, sees us, responds to our prayers, and is this personal God. Now, how do you reconcile the two? That's the, what is it, $4 million or $18 million question or something. How to connect this transcendent God who is outside of time, outside of, being, existence, and so on. And this God who is following every one of us minute by minute and is responding to us. The last thing I want to say is to go back to the question of before the Big Bang. One of the questions, the Muslim philosophers themselves in medieval ages argued for an eternal universe and said the universe must be eternal, following Aristotle and so on, and said, no, the universe has existed forever and will exist forever. Why? Even though there may be, of course, creation of humans at some point, and there is a day of judgment for humans and so on, but creation for God must be co-eternal to him because it is part of his nature to be creator. He was always creator. He did not become a creator on a moment when he decided, let me make this universe. So if he created the universe at some point, does it mean he wasn't a creator before? So that was the argument to make that the universe must have existed at all times. However, some others said, but how do you know that our universe or this cosmos or these heavens and earth is the only type of creation that God has made? Indeed, in the Quran, we read very often that he refers to himself as the God of the worlds, Rabbul Alameen. Alameen is plural of alam, which in every translation today in the Arabic language, alam means world. Now, in the past, they used to think Alameen does not refer to worlds, refers to peoples or communities. He's the God of all peoples. That's the way they understood this phrase. And then people started to say, no, maybe it means God of the worlds, because there is no guarantee that we are the only world. Maybe there are other worlds in the same universe, and maybe there are other universes which would have been created before or after. And since God is outside all of this, and in a statement, and also another famous statement in the Quran, God is always at work, meaning God is always creating. It means he was creating even before our universe existed. Creating what? Maybe other universes, maybe other worlds, maybe other types of creatures, other life. So there's this continuous, like, which way do you want to take it and which way do you want to consider it? Is he our God or is he the God of everything else where we are now only one little entity out of all of this? Maybe it's all of the above and our minds are just too small to comprehend all of that.
Well, Nidhal, seeing as you've raised the question of other worlds and other possible life forms, in the small amount of time we've got left, this is a subject that has always fascinated me ever since I was a student, and I'm involved in recent years in SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and more broadly in astrobiology, trying to understand the origin of life and how likely it is to have occurred on other planets. I've never thought there's a problem in Islam for the possibility of other inhabited worlds, even worlds inhabited by intelligent beings. Am I right? That doesn't present a problem in Islam, because it sometimes does in Christianity.
Yeah, for the most part, you are right. In fact, you can find in the tradition, and people cite some traditions, statements in the tradition from the earliest days, when people refer to the existence of other species. In fact, some people have found confirmation even in the Quran that there may be some creatures, dabba, some creature, some living organism that could be like an animal or perhaps even intelligent being existing in the heavens, meaning in other realms over there, in planets or moons or whatever. However, there is this sort of discomfort among many Muslims when I tell them, this is where it gets into a little bit of a disturbing discussion. When I tell them, if intelligent beings exist out there and if we discover them, then most likely they are way more intelligent than us. Because for us to detect even radio emission from them, it means that radio emission must have originated from them hundreds, thousands of years ago, since these distances are in the hundreds and thousands of light years, at least in our galaxy. Perhaps it's coming from other galaxies, in which case it's millions of light years, which means they would have invented radio technology millions of years ago. And in the million years that has passed, or even the hundreds or thousands of years that have passed, they would have reached some extraordinary levels of not just intelligence, but technology. And, to mention Arthur C. Clarke, they would be like magicians. Any civilization sufficiently advanced compared to us would be indistinguishable from magic. And so I tell them, prepare that if we discover other species out there and they are intelligent and we receive a radio signal or a laser or something, then it means we are like little ants compared to them. And that's when people just like, what? No, we can't have that. We are the vice regents. We were created by God to represent him here. And we were given this final revelation and this. And I say, yeah, all of this is for us here at Earth. It doesn't mean that God hasn't created others and given them another message way before us. So just be humble and, imagine that we are not necessarily at the top of all creation. Maybe we are the most intelligent and advanced creature here on Earth, but we are not necessarily the most sophisticated, advanced, even spiritually, even intellectually, even in our wisdom and so on. We may be still children compared to others. So that's the current discussion now as to what's going to happen next when we start discovering life, and especially if we do discover intelligent life out there.
Well, before we bring in Imam Tawil, I'd just like to ask you a sort of more practical question. So you've written a book for young Muslims, and I think we're all interested in trying to get young people fired up about the importance of asking the big questions and going into science, perhaps, to study them. So you work in the UAE, but more generally in the Muslim world, what are the career opportunities for young people? If they are inspired by reading your book, where do they go next? Is there a good career path? But particularly for young women, it's always been, for me, a big problem of how to increase female representation in the physical sciences. So do you have a few words for any youngsters who are listening to us?
Certainly. Well, let me give you a piece of good news. There's quite a bit of good news, actually, but just to start with young girls and young women, in the Arab Muslim world, especially in the Arab world, and especially here in the Gulf, surprisingly, maybe to some, girls and women in education in general, in universities in particular, and in the sciences are the big majority of students, of upcoming scientists are female now in the Arab Muslim world. There's a whole discussion as to why, and I've written about this, but now is not the time for that. For the science opportunities and careers that are coming up, there's another piece of good news, which is we have now started to move into basic science, the development and encouragement and promotion of basic science, space exploration. The UAE in July launched this HOPE probe to Mars, and people immediately asked, why do you want to go to Mars? I mean, we were doing fine for the last 15, 20 years. There's like 5, 6 Arab countries that have satellites, that have space agencies, but it was always only practical applied space. It was always satellites, it was always remote sensing, telecommunications and the like. But now all of a sudden it's like, no, we want to go to Mars and we want to send and the UAE sent an astronaut to the space station last September of 2019 it was. No, 2019, yes. And so people started to ask, why do we want to do that? And now it has started to be digested that we should and definitely need to promote this science endeavor, not just practical utilitarian applied science, which has existed in the region for several decades, but now people started to be convinced that yes, it makes sense to have a career in astronomy of all things, or maybe even in archaeology or something that has almost no direct benefit in everyday life. And indeed, now we are beginning to have projects that are going to set some big observatories, optical and radio observatories in the Arab world. This is beginning to happen. We have now a very good observatory in Morocco, is producing fantastically good work. We have a small observatory, very small, not world-class international type research, but right here in Sharjah, with just a few months back, a little radio observatory right here in Sharjah. There's a big one that is being prepared in Algeria, another very big one being prepared, observatory, being prepared in Egypt. And so there's now this big push to start to really invest in science in all its forms. The last example I want to give, or the last piece of news, a few weeks after the HOPE probe was launched in July, late July last year, the Prime Minister of the UAE launched an initiative to all Arab youth and said, we would like you to submit applications and proposals to join our space program, which is now diverse. Now it has satellites, it has a probe to Mars, it has an astronaut, and it announced also a future rover on the moon in 2024. So he made an announcement to all Arab youth saying, if you have good credentials and good ideas, submit an application and we will bring you here, all expenses paid, to participate in this space program. Within a few weeks, something like 35,000 people applied from the entire Arab world. So that tells you that there is really this thirst, and now people see opportunities. And even at the government level, now people don't ask, what's the point of this?
That's great. It's wonderful to hear such positive news. So thank you, Nidhal, for putting us in the picture. And I'd like to now bring in Imam Tawil, who's been patiently listening to what we've been saying, and invite him to make some brief, I'm afraid it has to be brief comments or ask any questions. So Omar, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Peace and blessings be upon everyone here. Thank you so much for hosting this discussion. I really feel like it's very beneficial for anyone who tunes in. It really is something interesting to hear of Dr. Nidhal's upbringing. He had parents who were deep educators and philosophers, and then he had this, mind for science, and it seemed like all of his curiosities were perfectly aligning with all of what his parents had, taught him. Particularly his father, whom he said was a religious scholar and a philosopher, which then perfectly sets him up to, have a very thorough understanding of Islamic theology, right? And what is it that, is a problem, and what is it that isn't a problem? And really, this is I believe, my field of inquiry more than anything else, which is Islamic theology, or kalam, right? Where the kalam cosmological argument comes from. And I always try to show Muslims who are going into STEM fields that this curiosity that you have for science and for empirical knowledge, it's not something where you leave your faith at the door. It's actually something that you take your faith with you and fuel your passion and your desire and your curiosity. So I really feel like, Dr. Nidhal, I really thank you for your sharing with us that background that you've had, and the encouraging parents that you've definitely had in your quest of seeking more knowledge. And indeed, it does affect us greatly as Muslims to know that this was something that was normal in the classical era and in the medieval era, where theologians and scientists didn't clash. There wasn't a preference that someone would took. They took themselves wherever the knowledge would take them, obviously being grounded in revelation. And I wanted to ask both you and Dr. Paul a question that oftentimes baffles me, or it doesn't baffle me. It's just, I feel like we ought to throw this out there more often, which is, we understand that each field of inquiry has its set limitations and its own objectives. And I wanted to know is, can we delineate what the objectives and the limitations of science are? And where does it end, those limitations, and maybe where rationality then may take over? Because when we speak about theology, in particular as Muslims, rationality is on par, with empirical knowledge, and rationality is how we explain the revelation and the empirical knowledge that we've come across through our observation and our methods and so on and so forth. So what are the limitations and its objectives, and when does rationality then take over, or when does that become the more relied upon method of inquiry?
Nidhal, do you want to go first on that?
Paul, maybe you can start and then I'll follow up.
I'm sorry. Well, I've always been fascinated whether the scientific method can really answer all questions. My real interest is, can we ever give a closed and complete account of existence, of everything that exists and why it exists the way it does? It seems very ambitious. And in practical science, of course, you very soon hit limits. Now, cosmology is the most pretentious of the sciences because it claims to try to explain the entire universe, including its coming into being, maybe from nothing, and its evolution and possibly its end. I think cosmologists are the first to admit that there are limitations to what they're doing. Sometimes these are practical or financial limitations, but the subject has come on in leaps and bounds. So when I was a student, people used to say, well, there's speculation, and then there's speculation squared, and then there's cosmology. But it really has been transformed over the decades into a precision science, partly because of satellites, partly because of improvements in ground-based telescopes. The discovery of the heat radiation from the Big Bang, the so-called cosmic microwave background in the late 1960s, has been enormously informative. And mining that background radiation for data using satellites has enabled cosmology to now become very much a precise science. But nevertheless, there are still very deep issues, in particular about the ultimate origin of things. And it's fascinating to sort of speculate that maybe we can enlarge our conceptual framework and eventually capture all of the mysteries of existence. But there's no particular reason to suppose that humans can do this. Our brains have evolved to survive in the proverbial jungle, and I think it's astonishing. So for me, the main reason, I should say, of why I feel there is some sort of meaning or purpose in the universe is that humans can come to understand through science and mathematics, understand something about how the universe works. I think it's totally astonishing that this particular species can grasp this sort of hidden substructure of reality, and that we've done so well. But there's no guarantee that we won't hit limits, and certainly there are practical limits. So that's my take on it, but I'd be interested to hear what Nidhal has to say.
Yeah, I think there are clearly some questions that are almost by definition outside of science. I mean, okay, even if we explain the origin of the universe, it will be on the basis of something. I mean, we have to start with some principle. We have to start with some axiom, let's say, in mathematics, as they say in mathematics. And so it will always be, but why this? Why that? And we can't have an infinite regression. And so it seems to me that at some point there's going to be the need for some overriding principle, something that we start with. We can't keep on explaining. Why is there a universe? Can we explain that? Is it possible? I don't mean necessarily by raising these questions that I reject all of this. I'll hit you with sort of my final point at the end. But at the same time, okay, so what are we? Why are we here? And what's my mind and my consciousness? Is there consciousness in all living beings, or no, not all of them? Is there consciousness in non-living beings? You know, this panpsychism that is becoming a bit of a fashion nowadays in some places. So there are some issues, not to mention, of course, all the questions of ethics. Where do ethics come from? Can we derive them from science, or from philosophy, or from religion, or from an interplay of all? I mean, that's the Conference on Religion, Ethics, and Science, right? This is CORES. So there are these fields, and it's not clear, you know, where science ends and where something else has to take over. The history of science has been a successful history of science pushing the boundaries. What we used to think are, you know, this is your limit, and then science says, I can do better, I can go forward, look, I can explain this now. You used to think that, hey, I cannot explain how you get, you know, boys or girls in conception or something. Now I can do it very easily. Now I couldn't explain to you why your eyes are blue or mine are black. Now look, here's the gene, or here are the two genes that contribute to this. And so there's always this pushing, but this pushing has always been within the realm of what we consider as sort of normal science. This is the physical world, and with experiments and equations and laws. Even the laws, are we sure that these are the laws, or we keep modifying them and improving on them? I mean, Newton's law of gravitation was sort of superseded by Einstein's general relativity. Likewise for, you know, Coulomb's law, Gauss's law, you know, there's all kinds of laws that we keep modifying. And so it's not always clear where science has to stop and something else has to take over. Is it at the ethics boundary? Is it at the origin questions, the big questions, where somehow science has made itself powerful and given to some people the impression that it can probably explain everything? I personally don't think science can explain everything, but where it ends is a bit of a gray area.
So we're almost out of time, but we do have a question from Misty. Misty, we have the technology that you can actually ask this in person if you wish. We need to wrap this up. Well, she was, I'll repeat it, she was wanting to know if you have any practical advice for young Muslim students wanting a career in science. You've outlined the enormous opportunities. When it comes to their studies versus their worship, for example, which can cause anxiety, I think in a lot of students, whatever is their religion, they sometimes feel a tension there, even if it's only a tension on competition for their time. Any words of advice, just very briefly?
Well, my big advice is, first, don't be afraid of science. Science is essentially what is our discovery of what God has created. So even if you find some things that are surprising, perhaps even sound in contradiction to what you learn traditionally, don't be afraid of it. Don't shut the door. Don't reject it. Read it, learn it, go through it. There may be this tension that Paul is referring to. There will always be some tension as to how do I digest this? How does this fit with what I learned? Does this mean that I cannot believe this now? There's always going to be this tension, but my experience has been whatever science establishes, this is the key idea here. And when you hear something or read some new scientific knowledge, don't accept it right away or reject it right away. Ask to what extent it is established, it is accepted, it has been confirmed by science. Something that is confirmed by science, please accept it and try to find a way to harmonize it with your faith, with your culture, with your identity. Don't ever feel that you have to make a choice between one or the other. The two can be reconciled, but it has to be done intelligently, with humility, with continuous search. And we're humans, we're limited in our understanding, and we are finite in our lifetime and capacity. And it is a journey. Life is a journey of learning. So many things I used to think and used to believe that I know, I have come to modify in my thinking. And I think that should be the philosophy that any young Muslim or non-Muslim going into the sciences should adopt. This attitude of humility and no fear.
This is wonderful. I wish we could talk for another hour, but we've used up our available time. It's been an enormous pleasure talking to you, Nidhal. Of course, we've known each other for a number of years, but we've never really had an opportunity to have a conversation like this. And I'm thrilled that we can do that as part of this broader initiative, this CORES initiative. And I'd like to also thank Imam Tawil. I don't think our paths have crossed before, but I trust they will do again if we can enter a post-COVID world at some stage in the coming year. And I just should thank Ben Sanders, of course, for his tireless efforts in organizing this event and the other parallel events that go with it. So I think I have nothing more left to do than to bid you all goodbye, and thank you very much for the conversation.